Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. I'm back after a few weeks where I was focused on other work and other projects, so it's great to be reconnecting with you here. At the end of January, I hosted my annual astrology planning retreat in Palm Springs with an absolutely wonderful group of humans. We learned, we laughed, we were moved. It was such a fun event this year. So I want to say a huge thanks to everyone who joined us. Throughout February, I'm actually going to be working on another project kind of behind the scenes. So I won't be here with you as regularly as normal. However, all going well, you will hear from me again towards the end of the month with an episode on the Virgo lunar eclipse, which is a clue about what today's episode is on. Of course, before we get to that lunar eclipse in early March, we're going to have a solar or new moon eclipse in Aquarius. That's going to be taking place on Tuesday, February 17th, around 28 degrees of Aquarius. And that is what I want to dive into with you all in today's show. If you have been missing my weekly podcast shows, you might enjoy my private astrology membership, where I am always sharing weekly and monthly video insights. As an eclipse special, you can actually sign up and save on your astrology guide membership during the week of the eclipse. So that membership promo starts February 16. Pop over to kellysastrology.com for details. So let's dive into this Aquarius eclipse. Now, before we actually get into talking through the chart and the specifics of the eclipse like we often do, I want to share a little bit about eclipses and what's going on with eclipses in 2026. So there's a little bit of preparatory info that I think will add to your understanding of this eclipse and how it might be influencing you. So this Aquarius eclipse is the first eclipse in the first eclipse season of 2026. So we have two eclipse seasons every year, about 6 months apart. We've got our first eclipse season kind of loosely mid-February to mid-March. Our second eclipse season is basically August of 26. Now, this eclipse is also the first eclipse across this Leo-Aquarius axis. And that's important because that tells us that a new cycle or kind of a new pairing of eclipses is beginning. So starting this month, February 26, and running through until January of 2028, almost 2 years, we're going to be experiencing eclipses on this Leo-Aquarius axis. So even before we get into the details of the eclipse chart itself, I think it's useful for you to know that the eclipses and their associated themes of agitation and kind of swirling or stirring up energy and experiences, those themes are now beginning to kind of shake up a new pair of houses in your personal chart. So essentially, it's not quite the same as a transit, but you could conceptually frame it this way, that it's as if the eclipses are now going to be activating or cycling through the Leo and Aquarius houses in your personal chart. And of course, the topics that Leo and Aquarius represent socially and collectively will now be topics that we're all experiencing, this kind of shake-up, disruption, break with the past energy of the eclipses. So, we can think about eclipses are often linked to this idea of the nodal dragon or the cosmic dragon. And the nodal dragon is taking us all somewhere new. So even though we have eclipses every 6 months, and we usually have 2, but sometimes we can have 3 at, each 6-month interval, eclipses have general energy of like shake-ups and agitation, but of course they have more specific energy. And part of that comes from the pair of signs they're moving through. So big takeaway just from this first part is that eclipses are moving into new signs, which means that for the next 2 years, there are different themes tied to eclipses that we want to be exploring. Okay. Of course, there's always so much more data, but I think that gives us the gist of it. So if we think about Leo and Aquarius represent leaders and the collective, the people. Leo would be the leader, the authority, the figurehead, and Aquarius would be the collective, the community, the people, the group of many, if you like. Leo is like the singular and Aquarius is the many. It's another way of thinking about it. And so when we think about eclipses across the signs of Leo and Aquarius, these eclipses might mean shifting alliances and power dynamics amongst different leaders. It may describe changing relationships between a leader and the people they represent. The undercurrents or the agreements, both the implied ones and the explicit ones between one who leads and those who follow are getting a shakeup. And it's almost as though new bargains or new agreements must be made. So I think it's really helpful as we get into these Leo Aquarius eclipses to think about the people and the power of the people, the community, the collective, and the power that the people really give to the leader. Of course, leaders sometimes take power, they impose power, but, kind of maybe this essence or ideal form is that, the collective comes together and chooses or elects a leader. It's not always that way, but that is obviously the underlying intention. So a leader can only lead if the people are willing to follow. And if the people aren't happy with the direction that a leader intends to take them, then it can follow that the leader must adjust or deal with being replaced. And these are themes that come up in the Leo-Aquarius polarity. That idea of the relationship or dynamic between a leader and the people that they are kind of representing or acting on behalf of. And of course, we'll be seeing this politically, but we're going to be negotiating it even at kind of smaller centers of power and dynamics. Is there a leader in your social group? Is there somebody who tends to be the leader in your family dynamic? And what are the kind of different roles or changing qualities of experience there as maybe different people want to step into the leadership role in your kind of local everyday life? So these questions around maybe leaders and people and power dynamics, these are likely to intensify as we enter into these eclipses across the Leo and Aquarius axis. So who has power? Where does that power come from? Is power something that is held by the few or shared amongst the many? These are all parts of the Leo-Aquarius eclipse dynamics. So we're going to be exploring that. It's around every 8 to 9 years that we have eclipses via the nodes, essentially revisiting the same pair of zodiac signs. And so if we know we're about to begin a cycle of eclipses across Leo and Aquarius, we could look back to, 2017 and 2018, which is the last time that we had eclipses in Leo and Aquarius. At that time, the nodes were in the opposite places to where they are now. So right now, the nodes are coming into Leo and Aquarius in the middle of 2026. We should be really clear. But of course, we can have eclipses in the signs that the nodes aren't in. Now we're getting a little technical. But what we will have is we will have the North Node in Aquarius in 2026, 27, 28, and the South Node in Leo. 8 years ago, when we were having Leo Aquarius eclipses, it was the reverse. We had the South Node in Aquarius then, and we had the North Node in Leo. So still having eclipses across that Leo Aquarius axis, but with slightly reversed nodal themes. If we want to go back to the last time we had Leo Aquarius eclipses with the nodes in the exact same places, we have to go back 18 years to get to the last time we had Leo South Node eclipses and Aquarius North Node eclipses. So you can see the nuance and the layering that goes into working with different eclipse cycles. But certainly it's, I think, helpful to know 8 to 9 years since we've had any eclipses in Leo-Aquarius. The next 2 years will be partly defined by these eclipses across the Leo and Aquarius axis, and lots of themes about changing dynamics between people and leadership that are going to emerge on small scale and also on a large scale. So with that kind of background info shared, let's dive into the eclipse, which is happening on February 17. So technically speaking, this is a new moon or solar eclipse. And what that tells us is that, yes, the sun and moon are together. It also tells us that it's the solar principle or the solar thing, the sun, whose light is temporarily blocked. So that's important to know. The light of the sun is temporarily blocked. It is also a north node eclipse. So at this particular eclipse, it's at 28 Aquarius. That's where the sun and moon come together. The nodes are still technically moving through Pisces and Virgo, and that's just part of how eclipses work. The node itself is at 8 Pisces, and then the lunation is at 28 Aquarius. So the effects or energy of the eclipse we're really feeling at that 28 Aquarius place. So there's a few technical notes. It's a north node eclipse because at the time of the eclipse, the moon is nearest to the north node. So these two factors, it's a solar eclipse and it is a north node eclipse, they do add a kind of urgency and a hunger, this sort of like, insatiable craving for the new, the next step for going forward. This is an eclipse that's very restless and really wants to move forward, to break away from the past. So there's a sense of kind of moving forward at all cost because, an eclipse has an intensity that isn't always like practical or grounded. The North Node does add this insatiable quality, this sort of can't get enough, impossible to be satisfied vibe. And that might mean that around this eclipse, you are so focused on a task or a topic that you actually override the needs of your body or you override your emotional capacity. So there's a little bit of caution about overdoing it around this eclipse. And so making sure you take breaks, that you care for your body, you feed, nourish, rest your body, and that you try to stay within kind of reasonable limits is going to be important. And a lot of that is tied to that North Node influence, which is very intensified at the eclipse. Now, as always, there's so many little extra features that we can talk about with a lunation event, especially like an eclipse. So I also wanted to bring in Uranus when we think about this eclipse. So we mentioned that the eclipse is at 28 Aquarius, and that means that it's in a tight square to Uranus, which is at 27 Taurus. So an eclipse itself is already a kind of turbulent, swirling energy event. And then we're going to add in this sort of dramatic square angle from the disruptor, the rebel, the revolutionary planet Uranus. So it's definitely a kind of an eclipse where I would expect there'll be some chaos, some upheaval, that idea of things being like a lot happening in a short space of time. That's definitely something we want to keep in mind. So with Uranus, in this eclipse being square to Uranus, it could be that classic case, with Uranus of expect the unexpected, surprises or unpredictable events and developments are kind of heightened or more likely. That's what we're talking about often with Uranus. It could be that the eclipse reveals that a change to pursue freedom and individuality will be necessary. So this eclipse very much has this sort of shaking up the old, pursuing the new, making changes, like breaking down structures, breaking free from tradition or limits or restraints in some capacity. So there's a lot of that kind of shake-up energy for sure in this eclipse. Now, one thing that I think is always worth saying when we're talking about eclipses is that eclipses kind of play with shadow and with light, like with light and darkness and shadow. And what we mean by that is, we're talking about shadows and light. We're talking about these ideas of what can we normally see? What is normally visible that might become obscured or blocked? Just like at the time of the eclipse, the way the sun's light, which we can normally see, gets obscured or blocked. And so eclipses bring forward this idea of a temporary disruption or interruption of the regular pattern of things. It's like a time when exceptions are more likely. And with the kind of things that we normally see being blocked, what we normally see, obviously it isn't visible. As a result of that, we might notice other features or nuances that we typically don't attune to. And that's what I mean by this kind of dance between shadows and light. If the light's on, you focus on certain things. If the light's off, you're kind of attuned via different senses to different things. So during this eclipse, regular or typical things might be unavailable or offline. And this shift in focus and attention might mean that you notice or become aware of something that you're often too busy or too distracted to spot. So as you're experiencing, day to day, on the day of the eclipse, the 17th, or maybe even for a day or two before and after, as your regular rhythms and patterns are kind of disrupted or not happening like they normally do, what is it that you can connect with instead? That to me is always the magic of an eclipse. What did the eclipse kind of shake up or change in my normal rhythms, my normal routines? So I was able to connect with something that I don't normally get a chance to. And even though it can be maybe a little frustrating to not have what you normally have, it can be a blessing or a very powerful piece of insight to notice what you don't normally notice. And that's what we want to try and do with eclipses. Now, as longtime listeners of the podcast will know, we often, when we're talking about an eclipse or a lunation, we always like to take a look at the ruler of the eclipse. And so with this eclipse in Aquarius, traditionally Aquarius is a sign ruled by Saturn. And so the ruler of this eclipse is Saturn. And of course, Saturn has just arrived in Aries. And that adds kind of two really important features to this eclipse. First of all, we have the eclipse ruler in this state of newness, of discovering a new place, of settling into a new location. When a planet enters a new sign, it's like it's unpacking its bags and settling into a new environment. It's figuring out what is comfortable and enjoyable about the environment that it's moved into. It's also figuring out things about what isn't comfortable. Is the temperature set too high or too low? Is it too bright, too dark? Are the right snacks or the wrong snacks? That's kind of what Saturn is still doing. It's barely been in Aries for a week at the time of the eclipse. And this kind of state of newness of the eclipse ruler reinforces these themes that we already have from this eclipse being the first one in a new sequence or cycle. So this eclipse is really taking you into new territory. It is ruled or guided by a planet that is trying to find its way in a new place. And so that idea about discovering what is new or different about where you are now, that we really get from the eclipse ruler Saturn. So we could sort of take in here as well that this is reaffirming or repeating that theme, that this eclipse represents maybe the beginning or the start of heading in a new direction, or at a very simple level, it's a new cycle, a fresh start maybe. Now, technically, Saturn is in its fall placement in the sign of Aries. And that can represent or symbolize things that are kind of falling down, coming off a pedestal, or being brought to ground in some way. And so this eclipse might bring clarity around something that isn't working, that has kind of fallen off its perch or its pedestal. Or this eclipse might help you understand something that won't actually go the way that you'd hoped it would. So if you do have a realization like this, that clarity is actually a gift of Saturn. It'll be really important to pay attention to those realizations. It might feel like a disappointment or a frustration. We've put a lot of energy or preparation into trying to get this theme going in that direction, and it's just not going to come off the way we'd hoped. Maybe it's not going to come off in the timeline that you were expecting, or maybe we need to go back to the drawing board and kind of revision what we were intending to do. So this influence of Saturn can bring some clarity. It can bring a bit of a reality check. It might even bring forward the understanding that some cracks actually can't be repaired. Some relationships may never be what they once were. And those kind of realizations might hit home in new ways around this eclipse. Now, in turn, those realizations might lead to new wisdom about time, about aging, and about transitions. And that could help you realize where in life you might be ready to actually wind something down or to let an old pattern come to its natural end. Eclipses are by their nature quite disruptive. They represent this interruption or disruption to the regular pattern of things. And an eclipse ruled by Saturn in its fall placement, things are, we get the regular eclipse disruption. And then as a result of that, we see the cracks that we didn't know were there. We might really become attuned to a weak spot that we want to dig a little deeper in to do some research. Should we be repairing and patching this weak spot? Or is this kind of cluing us in that this whole entity is not sustainable in its current form? So this idea of structures and form and sustainable or secure and stable and not being secure and stable, that's all part of this kind of eclipse energy. And even though there's a lot of this eclipse energy that is pushing towards new, there is something about the condition of Saturn and also the aspect Saturn's making, of course, with Neptune, which we'll mention in a second, that might suggest before you get to the new, we've got to let something end or wash away. Okay, that is just in such a state of disrepair, we need to maybe, go back to the drawing board. I do think that this eclipse offers fresh perspective, and that is coming a lot from Saturn, questioning things that you've always held to be true, pushing back on accepted wisdom or tradition. That can be a piece that, Saturn in fall might share with Uranus, for instance. And so I think through this eclipse, noting what wisdom kind of seems of special interest to you, paying attention to the goals or the priorities that you are aware are changing. I think that's going to be really important. They might seem big, and that can mean we have a tendency to ignore them or set them aside, but just sort of sit with them through this eclipse. And I kind of briefly mentioned Neptune, but of course we should say something a little bit more about Neptune because it's really impossible to mention Saturn right now without including Neptune, since they are so close together, just cuddled up at 0 degrees Aries right now. And even though there are so many threads in this particular eclipse that sort of indicate forging ahead into new territory, with the eclipse ruler Saturn conjunct Neptune right now, that suggests a surrender or a letting go. It indicates it might be time to stop holding so tightly to something or even someone. Perhaps it's time to kind of let what once was be washed away with the tide and instead embrace a little time in that womb-like state of nothingness. I also wonder about this idea of what kind of battle are you fighting? Is the fight leading to the results or outcome you wanted? Is the fight, worth it to continue having? And of course, there's macro fights that are, kind of going on about, there's literal wars happening. There's also, the fight for different rights and all those types of topics at big picture collective levels. And then in each of our individual lives, there's little battles that we're fighting, each day about what's important, what's not important, what we're trying to do more of, what we're trying to do less of. And it's really with this eclipse being ruled by Saturn, it does pull in that Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And that idea of the washing away of some forms and structures so that we can dream up first a new vision that then inspires the structure or the form to come. So some of that comes into this eclipse as well. And that idea of with Neptune in the mix, we've got this kind of nothingness or this washed away piece. The unknown and dealing with uncertainty, which I also think is something Neptune invites us into a closer relationship with. That's always tricky for our human psyche to grapple with. But there is something about this eclipse that suggests a few moments, maybe a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, a short period inside that empty void might ultimately prove fruitful. As things wash away now, maybe pause before embarking on the new. There is a real feel of urgency, to this eclipse, this sense of I have to rush with the North Node and Saturn in Aries. But I think in the long run, a pause before launching might prove most beneficial. And it seems entirely appropriate to do that given the eclipse and the role of Neptune now. One of the tricks of working with eclipses is that their timelines are not always immediate. And even though this eclipse represents and promises and indicates so many things that are about heading in new directions, breaking new ground, new projects, etc., they don't all have to begin immediately. It may be that there is an important activation inside you or realization, a clarity. It may be that there's an initial meeting or action that is sort of the preparation of what's to come. And that may be what you're dealing with in the days near the eclipse. But ultimately, this eclipse might represent a bigger pivot that does take some months to unfold. And knowing that eclipse timing isn't as simple as on the day of the eclipse, it can be linked to timelines for many months afterwards. It's a clue with Neptune kind of in the immediate vicinity that the pause means you won't miss out on something that is necessary for your long-term kind of evolution. So I think it's a lot to play around with timelines there. So it's like the shadow and light of the eclipse, but also the interplay between what's immediate and what is kind of, marinating for the future. I would love to hear how the eclipse is shifting things for you. Is it shifting things inside you? Is it shifting things in your external life and experiences? Let us know in the comments below. If you're ready to learn more astrology, check out my extensive back catalogue of webinars to learn more. I have webinars on the eclipses, I have webinars on working with the nodes from a traditional perspective, and many, many more webinars as well. If you'd like to find out what's in the back catalogue, go to the homepage, kellysastrology.com, select the Learn Astrology tab, and when those new menu options pop up, click on Browse Webinars, and you'll be able to scroll through the entire back catalogue. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. I will hopefully, all going well, see you again in a couple of weeks for more eclipse insights. For now, I wish you all the very best throughout February, and we'll talk soon.